So, hi Diana. So, I just wanted to ask you, like, one thing that I want to start off with is your book on extraterrestrials.
Sure.
You are a philosopher of religion, and then how do these two worlds collide?
Sure. So what I do actually, I'm a comparative religious studies academic, and I look at most specifically Catholic history, so it's European history, and American and Canadian as well. But for the most part, it's European, and so I spend a lot of time in archives looking at old documents from thousands of 1,000 years ago and to a couple of 100 years ago. And this is how I was interested. I became interested in the topic of extraterrestrials or UFOs. I didn't believe unbeliever, agnostic now, but complete atheist with respect to UFOs or UAPs as they're called now, unidentified aerial phenomena. And what happened was that I uncovered a lot of records of people from 1200, 1300, 1500, who had experiences of things that looked like discs in the sky and aerial phenomena. And they would interpret these within their own cultural frameworks. And so I had a list of these, and I didn't quite understand what to make of them because the patterns were similar. And then what happened was that a friend of mine took a look at this after I'd written a book on purgatory and the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. And so this person said that it appeared to him to look like, the media, like Steven Spielberg films, E.T. and things like that. And of course, I thought he was being ridiculous. But that weekend, there was a conference of people who were experiencers of UFOs and UAPs. So I went to the conference and I heard exactly what I had been looking at in the records from historical records. And so that's when I decided that this was a really interesting belief system that I needed to look at. And so that's really how I got into studying the UFO phenomena as basically an unbeliever, a disbeliever. I didn't believe, but that's when religious studies, we aren't necessarily believers. We're not advocating for religion. We study religion from an academic perspective. So some of us are archaeologists, some of us are sociologists, historians, so we use these tools to study religion, and we don't advocate for religion. So I like to make that disclaimer for my field just to kind of let people off the hook, in my field when people say, oh, you study this. No, we don't believe it. We just study it. You can study something without actually believing it. But through the course of my study, I became a agnostic with respect to this phenomenon.
You spoke about like you going to study religious texts in the Vatican before, and like you've like kind of discovered stuff that is very similar across different religions or sightings, and how angels were like described, and then how it's changed into like a cherub type figure that we know of now.
Mhm.
What was very similar to the initial sightings in the records versus what is very similar to alien sightings now? Or am I, again, like you mentioned it a bit before,
Mhm.
and like what exactly would be like a person who has no knowledge of it wouldn't understand, because we don't have access to those records that you've gotten.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so the first thing that I noticed, because I have written about this, and a lot of my work is actually free and online, and if people are interested, they can look at some of my articles. So I've mostly written a lot of articles, and I have some books, but the articles are free and online. In one of the articles, what I do is I do an analysis, a comparison between a person who has seen or believes that they've had experience and seen UFOs, and they've been written about by John Mack, who is a Harvard professor who wrote about this in the 1980s. And so he has a chapter in that book. His name is Edward Carlos. And then I go back and I compare his experience to Teresa of Avila. So this would be this nun from basically this nun in the 1500s who had some experiences that looked very similar to what we'd call today UFO experiences. And so we can actually see some of the ways in which the Catholic Church has represented her experience. So there was a famous statue, or is a famous statue in Rome by Bernini, um, and it's called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and it's beautiful, right? It looks like she's having an ecstatic experience, and there's this little angel next to her, and it looks like what we would consider to be an angel. So when we think of angels, we tend to think of these beautiful beings with wings, and they're nice looking, they don't look scary. But if you actually go through even texts like the biblical texts, or even her own dialogue about, because she wrote an autobiography in the 1500s about her experience, these are scary experiences that these people have, and these things that we're now referring to angels, they don't look at all like how we see them today. So if you look at the statue of Teresa, if you look at how she describes it, it doesn't look like that. And if you look at what are called biblically accurate angels, they look pretty scary. They don't look like little cherub things, which, I mean, really, if you look at it, I think what the artists did was they, back in 1500, or, whenever they represented these, the Louvre is filled with these paintings, right? And so is the Vatican Museum. What do these things actually look like? So if you go to the primary source material, which would be in Latin or, 17th century Italian, what you would see is something completely different. You'd see something that looks pretty scary. And a lot of times the people would say themselves, this is frightening, and so, but how do they represent it? So I think a lot of the artists went back to Greek versions of Eros, and they said, okay, we're going to depict this being like the Greek version of Eros. And that became then a convention, something that people artistic convention. Let's represent angels in this way. But that's not what they really look like if you go to the primary source material and you uncover that. So that's basically what alerted me early on in my research about UFO sightings. We also have that same convention today. So if you go to, say, Star Wars, or if you go to E.T. or Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we're going to see an artistic convention of how to represent a UFO. And people will look in the sky and say they'll see something completely unknown, but it won't look like what they saw in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They will discount it and say, oh, that's not a UFO. Why? Because it doesn't look like how we've learned to look at these things. So we're taught how to see these things that are unknown. And so that's what I'm trying to break up here in this book. So that was the first thing I noticed. The similarities are that when we see these things, we're interpreting them through a specific cultural lens. And that lens differs from today, from, 1500s, it changes. But it's a similar process.
But why was this depiction of angels or our belief systems or what we see, and what terminology or language or the site that we see it from changes? Like, okay, yes, they were scary, like when you go by the historic context of how an angel was depicted and versus what it is now, this whole transition. The same thing you speak about purgatory. There was something called purgatory, and then by 2007, 2007 was completely taken off from text and saying that that doesn't exist because it didn't work well with our understanding of having souls trapped in between heaven and then life in between. So what was the reason for this narrative change, and why do we change things that we would historically believe to be like religious text?
Yeah, so there's the assumption that religion and religious texts and things like that, they're transhistorical. They don't change through time. Okay. And that's just an assumption. Because if you do go back, you mentioned my book about the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. No one practices, and no Catholic today is engaged in praying for souls in purgatory. Some are, but it's the minority. Most, if you ask them, have no idea what purgatory is, and even that it is a doctrine of their church. Okay. So, but if you go back 100 years ago, there were churches they had specific places for people to do devotions to souls, to get souls out of purgatory. If your, grandmother, you thought your grandmother may be in purgatory, you're going to pray that her soul has a release soon. Okay. So the question is, why? Why those things? Obviously, we discard these beliefs, if not as doctrines, we discard them as practices. And thus, if we discard them as practices, we won't believe in them anymore, and they will go away. Okay, so, but do they actually go away in reality? That's the question. All right, that religious people should ask themselves. So you're asking the question, why is this change? Why do we have changing belief systems? Basically, I think because we have different ways of looking at the world and different tools. So the telescope has given us an idea of what's out in space, and that changes how we view ourselves within cosmological, within worldviews, right? So I think that we also have microscopes. Microscopes have given us an insight into biotechnology and DNA and these kinds of things, the structure of reality. I think that the ways in which we view what we consider ultimate questions, those have to change as our technology and our tools change, because we see different things.
But okay, so let's go back to purgatory itself. Like, how did what was the evolution? What's the transition from it existing then to limbo? Because limbo and purgatory are apparently different. What was the story behind that?
Okay, good. That's a great question. And most people don't ask me about that. And also, most people don't understand it as well. So, okay, purgatory came about. The first word purgatory wasn't actually in use in European Catholic culture until the 1200s. Okay, so this is a long time after Jesus is crucified by Rome, and then Catholicism becomes a state Roman religion, and all of a sudden, in the 1200s, purgatory becomes a thing. What I show in my book is that purgatory was actually a practice before that. People believed in the purgation of their sins through these practices. They find these caves. One of these caves is in Ireland, and the cave doesn't exist anymore, but the place as a pilgrimage site still exists, and it's called Loch Derg. And so early Catholics, we're talking about 1000, 1100, would go to this cave in Ireland if they were particularly bad, say they were sinful. Knights who had engaged in violent behaviors due to the Crusades would end up at this cave, okay? And they would have to have a letter from their bishop that said, yes, indeed, this is a pretty evil person, and they need to go in this cave and purge their sins, right? And so they would spend the night in this cave, and they would have experiences of confronting their own sins, maybe seeing, this is, a long time ago. So they have a belief in angels and demons as realities and not separate from our reality, right? So they would encounter demons and angels and things like that. And if they survived this experience the next day, their sins were forgiven them. Okay. So this was the practice of purgatory. And this wasn't a doctrine. There hadn't been officially decreed a doctrine yet, but the practice was so prevalent among Catholics that it became recognized as a doctrine. So does that make sense how that works?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And then what about limbo?
Yeah, so limbo, which is Latin for edge, okay? So limbo was already a belief in early Christian and even Jewish, in the Christian and Jewish religions and cultures. And it was this idea that there was a place where, what happened to the people who were really good, but died before the salvation of Jesus. So this was the question, right? So limbo became this place where people like the patriarchs of Judaism, like Abraham, when he died, he'd go to limbo, okay? And in fact, it was called Abraham's bosom. So it was this place where people died, virtuous pagans like Socrates, would end up in limbo. So limbo wasn't heaven, but it wasn't hell, because these are virtuous people, but they were born before Jesus came along and changed history, according to Christians. And so limbo became then something where, like, children who weren't baptized but who passed away would end up. So this became a belief system within the church because people already believed it. So they kind of codified it as a doctrine. And then in 2007, the then Pope Benedict reconsidered it and decided that we shouldn't have this idea anymore. So limbo was abolished. And because people weren't really educated in their own belief system, they associated limbo with purgatory, because where was limbo, right? So people tend to think of these places as geographical places. And in fact, they used to be on maps.
Hmm.
Okay, so the Garden of Eden used to be on a map. So if you look at old cartography, like maps of the world, you'll see these sacred places. Okay, and so people tend to think of them as places. And so Benedict wanted to get rid of this notion of these places. And so he said, there's no place called limbo. There's no place called purgatory. But people are still believing that there are these places. It doesn't matter to them whether, and we have virtual reality now. Is that a place? Well, in a sense it is, right? But it's not a place like that I can't reach out and shake your hand right now. Okay. But we see each other and we're talking together. So it's another form of a place. So people still want to conceive of these, like purgatory as a place or limbo as a place. And so they were confused. And it doesn't make things even easier to think through these concepts, because people are talking about them as places where bodies would be burning, or people would experience different, like Dante, right? He wrote the Purgatorio and the Divine Comedy, and he's talking about purgatory as an island in a place. By the way, he got that from a book about purgatory that was a bestseller in the 1200s. So he was influenced by these ideas as well. So this idea of limbo, it was conceived in different ways. Some of the ways it was conceived was that it was the edge of heaven or the edge of hell. So whatever it is, it's always an edge. It's always in this place on the edge of some other place. But yes, it's no longer a doctrine in the Catholic Church.
What makes someone believe in something? Like, it evolved over time, and then purgatory never existed, and like the Pope at that time said, okay, this is gone, like let's take it off.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Like, one day someone gets up and like, okay, changes the laws, and like completely we believe in one thing. Like, this, we could give an example of COVID. Like, now it's there, and then now it's gone. Like, new rules are come up. It's not like as serious as we considered it to be. No masks, no everything, and then we all comply. And then sometimes we be like, okay, no, this doesn't make sense. And then there are a few outliers. How does belief change, and what navigates belief in whatever we have in that culturally accepted understanding?
This is such a great question. And what I try to do in my book, American Cosmic, is I try to explain how we believe in UFOs and why we believe in them. And not just UFOs. I'm just taking that as an example of how people tend to believe things. And for better or for worse, and I tend to think it's for worse, people believe too easily in things. Okay. And so their beliefs are easily manipulated. And so what are the ways in which we are taught to believe things? So what I did was first off, I asked this question in the first book about purgatory. And what I found was that people were already doing things that encourage belief. A lot of times what you do physically is going to encourage your cognitive, what I would call attitudes towards things. Okay. So rituals are very important in terms of cultivating belief, because they're things that you do regularly and they reinforce. So going to church, Jesus didn't go to church. Okay. Early Christians didn't go to church. All right. So how then do Christians now believe that they should go to church? Why? Well, this was something that wasn't easy to form over time, but it was decreed in the 1500s, kind of the counter reformation to the Protestant schism of Catholicism. People need to go to church because we need to reinforce, because people didn't understand, and still don't actually, their own religion, right? They don't understand its doctrines and dogmas and things like that. How do we do this? How do we create this condition? You can also see that in the American school system, which was completely different from 1850 to 1950. So we had the Industrial Revolution, right? So what we needed a lot of people who knew exactly what to do, how to wake up early, go someplace, be bored as heck, and come, come out of that and and do it again the next day. And what did we do? We created a school system that reinforced these kinds of things. So now what I see is I see that so certain people understood this process, like in the United States, at least. I mean, all over the world, but in the United States, that's my field of knowledge. So I've seen how this idea of basically inundating people with not just ritualistic types of things, like let's do this every Sunday, or let's watch this every March, it's going to be March Madness, or these kinds of things. But also, so there's a ritualistic component, but there's also being immersed within visual stimuli. So if you reinforce, you can reinforce belief by basically just inundating people with reinforcement. And a lot of this is coming directly out of my work with people who create films and the end technologies, like immersive technologies. So these kinds of things. One of the questions I asked in one of the big questions that I have is, why do people believe in things that we don't have evidence for? Because that seems to be what religion is, and that's also what, in my opinion, at the very beginning, UFOs were. Things that we didn't have evidence for. Why do so many people believe in this? And part of my journey was as the consultant for the Conjuring franchise, for the Conjuring. I was a consultant for the production company that created the Conjuring. And so what I did was I was able to see, because a lot of people believe, they don't believe in the movie itself, the exorcisms and the scary parts of this movie. It's about an exorcism, and but when they go, they are frightened, and they scream, at pertinent and relevant parts, and they go home and they keep their lights on because they're afraid to go to sleep at night. And so that's a belief, even though they do not believe it consciously. There are unconscious parts of the brain that are believing in this, and their bodies certainly believe it. So I wanted to know what was going on in those circumstances. Like, how do these things, how can we isolate those things and identify how to stop it if we want to, and, how it kind of progresses.
I want to make a connection between belief and synchronicity. So, like, there was this incident that I had as a kid. I was watching The Ring with my whole entire family, and there's a scene where the TV goes off. I'm not sure if you've seen that scene. And
Yes.
then the actual lights in my house just went off, and I was like,
Wow.
"Oh my God, we're gonna die!" And
That's great.
no one in my house had the balls to get up and just see what was wrong. It's like, "No, you're gonna do it. You're gonna do it."
That's great.
But the weird thing is that this is not just one incident. Like Carl Jung talks about synchronicity, and is that somehow connected to our belief system? And like, what we bring out in the universe brings us, gives back. Or I might be completely off on my understanding.
Yeah, synchronicity is very interesting. And for the book I first of all, a lot of synchronicity happened when I was doing the book. And so of course I had to look at it. And then I was doing work with the work of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung has written about synchronicity. Obviously, he coined that term, synchronicity, right? And also, his last book was about UFOs. So I spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung. And so obviously I'm looking at synchronicity. And then another scholar, Jacques Vallée, has written about UFO belief and also synchronicity and technology. He was on the team that did ARPANET, which was a form of the proto-internet. And so, and I know him and have worked with him a lot. Okay, so this idea of synchronicity, I think that first, we don't know, but I think there's some good theories and speculations. At this point, we can only speculate about it. It has to do with time, right? And now we're just understanding, in very important ways, how time is nonlinear. So synchronicity is one way to expose us to this nonlinear aspect of dimensions, right, in which we live. So I happen to have this idea, which can't be proven, but which I think that at this point we have to basically go where speculation is, and the research will catch up at some point. And so this is my speculation that synchronicity is the structure of is partially the structure of reality. Okay. And it is when we start to experience our lives in a way that we're not conditioned to see them, like I've talked about how we've been conditioned to see angels and we've been conditioned to see UFOs. Well, what if we just saw things for what they come to us as, and we try to lose our interpretive structures? I think that's when synchronicity happens. And a lot of times it's unexpected. And it scares us when it happens. It's like, wow, we have this training experience. But now that I've read a lot about people, especially scientists, who've had these experiences and they link them with their own discoveries. So basically creativity, they link them with creativity. So I think that it has to do with basically losing our, I don't think we should do this. Let's put it this way. When people have synchronistic experiences, a lot of times they think that this is guiding them. And it's kind of like this kind of overarching deity saying, you're on the right track, right? And so synchronicity is kind of like the engine of most religious belief. So I don't care who you talk to, if they're super religious, they practice, they've had synchronicity happen to them, and they attribute it to their God. Okay, whoever their God is. It could even be the Buddhist atheist idea, right? And they're like, I knew this was right because this happened. I think that's a mistake. I think that's when you make it a dogma. And I think what really synchronicity is trying to teach us is that there's no dogma. Like, lose the dogma and be. And then synchronicity shows up. So I'm with Friedrich Nietzsche, who's talked about this too. In his aphorism called A Personal Providence, he talks about synchronicity. And he thinks that we shouldn't try to attribute any special meaning to it. I think that it's just how crazy life is. That's how it is. And it's kind of, it's kind of giving you this really, if you wanted to be afraid during the ring, you certainly were, weren't you?
Almost like a childlike wonder with no, pre-notions of anything.
Yes.
I think it would make sense. Speaking of creativity, you have spoken a little bit about the muse and the source of it. And when we go back to like Tyler and like American Cosmic, where you speak about him being in connection to like extraterrestrial technology and that kind of being his source of information and then technology itself. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that and explain how that makes sense in a nonsensical sense? Because like it kind of sounds almost woo-hoo-ish if you don't understand where it comes from.
Yes, so it definitely sounds woo-woo-ish. There's no doubt about it. So what happened to me was that I had preconceptions about scientists, okay, before I got into working with them. And then once I started working with them, and a lot of them are creative geniuses, really, I recognized, not just through working with them, but also doing historical work in our own space program, that a lot of people who created the rocket technologies that have like got us off of Earth were also engaged in this really highly creative work. And they would do these protocols in order to bring this creativity on. Okay. And these were rituals that they would engage in. And they would also do these things, like they would practice by, they would sleep well, they would keep themselves hydrated. I know it sounds really strange, but they would do things that I identified as being something that monks and nuns would participate in. Kind of, they were living the lives of monks and nuns, and these are not normal lives. Like, they're not lives like I was living. Mother of children who were young, doing this work and having this job. My life, I drank a lot of coffee, right, to kind of, keep up with the workload. And, I didn't sleep a lot because I had to wake up and, drive kids places. So my work was antithetical to the work, or my life was antithetical the type of life that I had. So I started to look at what they were doing and how they were doing it instead of what they actually produced. Because it's, without a doubt, they produced amazing technologies. Okay. But how did they do this? and what was their belief system that allowed them to do this. And so that's what I thought was really interesting. So Tyler believed that there's no differentiation between human beings and technology. He was a biotech person. He has, like, at least when I knew him, he had 44 patents already, and he was going on and doing more and more. And these were things that were changing people's lives. So he was basically creating technologies that would then become inserted into the human body, like biotechnology. And so he also saw us as being electrical pulses, right? That were encased in water, because, we're like 70% water or something like that. And so he basically would then say, okay, so this is like technology, then how do we use this technology to create? And so that's how, and it does sound woo, but I think that science is now backing that kind of stuff up.
How is science backing that up though? Because I know like there's like in your book you do speak about like him coming up with patented technology, and then also the American space program and the Russian space program, the leaders of it, the founders of it, were ritualistically doing things which didn't make any sense to like common man. It's like, what are
Yes.
they doing and how is that connected?
Yeah. Okay. So how is that connected in terms of what they were doing, the kinds of things that they were doing? Okay. So here is where I think that we get into this idea that the brain creates on its own, that if you're really smart, you'll be able to do these things. Well, actually, the process of, when I'm talking about extreme creativity, I'm not talking about like, I painted this picture and it's pretty. Okay, that's creative, but it's not this extreme productive creativity that I'm talking about. So the people who were engaged in this type of extreme creativity were people who believed that they were getting these, what I called these downloads of information. They weren't trying to get them. They were just creating a space within their lives and their bodies and brains, or whatever you might call our body mind, right? Our physiological presence, creating the space to allow this stuff to come into them. So they were receptors. Tyler would literally use the terminology of receptive. We're receivers and transmitters. So we both transmit, but we also receive information. And so he would do these protocols. He would sleep 8 hours, but then make himself sleep 1 extra hour. And he said that this was a key. And then he would keep himself completely hydrated. And I think this has to do with the idea of this water, where, we have to, allow our bodies to be receptors. Okay. So he's basically creating the conditions such that he could receive this information. And then he did receive it, and it was never difficult for him. And then he would draw it, and then he would get a bunch of scientists together in a team. He would not tell them how he came up with this idea. He would just give them instructions, and then they would create it.
But how does that work? Like, who is sending him? Like he's accessing, he's transmitting this information.
Who's the external agent, right?
Exactly,
what is it? Right. Yeah. I don't know. And I don't even know if there is one. All I know is this. And people who've done work in creativity, and they've done like, imaging of brains and things like that, when people are in these creative states, what they found is that, and there's one woman in particular, and I wish I could remember her name. I'm going to have to send you a link so that you can, if any of your listeners are interested, she's a woman who's a researcher doing work in creativity, and I'm trying to remember her name, but I do cite her in my book. What she found was that the people engaged in these states, right, would attribute their creativity to something external. They wouldn't take agency for it. They wouldn't say, I did this. They thought, now, does that mean that something else did it? No, it doesn't. But it doesn't preclude that either. See? So I don't know. So a lot of people are saying, such and such did this for me. Extraterrestrials did this. They just gave me this information, or, that's what Tyler said. Do I believe that? I can't say yes or no. I have to remain completely, I can study it without actually identifying. The only thing I can say is that he attributes it to an external agent.
Is there some connection to like the external agent, the muse, and then psychedelics? I know this is a completely very different side of the conversation where people use psychedelics to reach that altered state of mind. They also like use that to come to flow state. And then is that the accessed realm, because we don't know where that comes from, because it's very similar, and that again, that synchronicity. I think you've mentioned in the past about Alex Gray, where he and his wife, like, they had psychedelics together, and then what she sees in her visions is similar to what he is seeing.
Yeah,
And in that same manner, is that the realm of like the space of the muse?
I think it is, but again, I think that we're at the very beginning of trying to figure out what's going on when people are doing this. And I do know a lot of people who are involved in the push right now to study at academic levels, at an academic level, like psychedelic use, and what happens. Um, so this is the difference, I think, because I know a lot of the people who've, like, the author of the Immortality Key and that kind of thing, who've written about this and spoken about it. Um, I've also had, I would call, an interest in this since I was a young person and exposed to a lot of the indigenous belief systems in Mexico. So you have people like Maria Sabina who used psilocybin to heal. And, so it's been very interesting to me to see. Um, Obviously, there's correlations between people who engage in extreme creativity and then people who take these, like psilocybin and then experience, or ayahuasca. All right. So the question, so just some preliminary observations on my part. People have been engaging in these protocols of creativity within groups, elite groups, and specialized communities for a long time, thousands of years. Okay. We usually call these, within the European Catholic tradition, we call these monastic communities. Okay. A lot of times these people are, they live apart from normal communities. Okay. So they don't have the requirements of making sure people are fed. They're usually not mothers. They're usually elite, and they're with each other. So they form communities to help each other through these things. And they are able to access, if there are these states, they're able to access these states within a framework, within a community framework that helps each other identify. Let's take an example. People can have, if they take a psilocybin or ayahuasca, they can have a really bad trip.
Hmm.
Okay. And they can see things that they wish they hadn't encountered and saw. Okay. When you're doing this organically and you have a community that supports this type of trip, right? But
Hmm.
it's not generated through psychedelics, I think it's probably better. And I'll tell you why. Because they already have in place ways to deal with encountering the demon, whatever the demon is. Okay. And it could destabilize your personality structure. Like, I don't want that. So so let's go back to my purgatory, my research in this cave. So this knight of the Crusades goes into this cave called St. Patrick's Purgatory, and he encounters demons, and he encounters, he does these things, but he's able to identify what to do once he does. Whereas if you're just an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old and you're going down to, South America to do an ayahuasca trip, and you encounter something that's so frightening that it seems demonic to you, what's going to happen? What's the aftermath? And I don't think that people, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but there are minders, people who help these people through these experiences. I mean, maybe they can help them, but I've met people who've been damaged through these experiences as well. So I would always suggest looking at the traditions that we already have because they've been tried, right? And
Hmm.
found to be helpful, rather than kind of doing it this other way. Plus, if you do it this other way, like Tyler didn't access these realms through drugs. He did them through, um, his lifestyle.
Hmm.
So I guess psychedelics now are the fast way to do that for those who have a lifestyle that doesn't support the other way of accessing.
But not everybody has that information. Like Tyler did have like, okay, a ritualistic practice of like, I'm gonna stay hydrated, I'm gonna sleep like 8 hours a day, like this is my thing, that there's no like negotiations. I wouldn't know that because I don't have access to that same information that Tyler did. One, and
Exactly.
then second, the question goes, like you said initially, go with it with almost like a childlike wonder, where you don't have any preconceived notions to what you are visualizing. But then, if you do not have the right tools to assimilate and then understand what you are envisioning, or through these trips or through accessing this kind of information, it could just completely disorient you.
Hmm.
So where does one find the balance where they can access this and yet still be stable enough at the other, on the other end?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that first off, we have to understand that when you get to the point where you want to incorporate something like this into your life, it's kind of like having a baby. You know, you're taking something on that you have an obligation to, and this is going to change your life. And when it does change your life, you've then an obligation to that knowledge that you have now. Okay, so you have to understand that it's actually a transformative experience, and it's not. And don't do it if you're just doing it for fun. Is my position on it, because once one starts to understand philosophy and one starts to use your critical thinking skills, there's no end to that. The only thing you can do to stop it is to sedate yourself with coffee, alcohol, and that's dangerous. So once you start to examine, the kinds of life structures that we live within, the stakes are pretty high there, and there's really no going back. So I would say that there's only sedation, basically. So yeah, so be careful. There's no like, hey, I'm going to do this on Sunday. And and this is like it's going to be cool. I'm going to do it like every Sunday. No, it doesn't. It's not. That's not how it goes.
He'll shake you up completely if you're not prepared.
Yeah, definitely.
Speaking of like accessing this kind of information, Tyler D, and a lot of people that you are in contact with, the Invisible College. Do you want to speak a little bit about the invisible and the non, like the visible one, and how it's differentiated, and what access do they have? What's different about each one of them, each of these
Oh,
groups?
sure, sure. Okay, so what I found almost right away when I started to do this research was that there was the Invisible College, of which Jacques Vallée has written about and spoken about, and so she isn't really invisible anymore. But it was this group of scientists who studied UFOs from the 1950s on through the 1970s, and they spoke together and did their research together, but they were invisible because they had to be, because of the stigma associated with studying UFOs, which, by the way, was partially generated by them. So it's an irony, but the Invisible College, like Alan Hynek is thought to be part of the Invisible College. He's no longer with us, but he was also the part of Project Blue Book, which was a debunking a program of debunking, from the Air Force. And so, okay, so on the one hand, we have this Invisible College who are working to debunk information about UFOs and UFO sightings, debunk these sightings while also studying them. Okay, now, okay, why were they doing that? Well, probably because they didn't understand what they were. Okay, I don't know, or else they were associated with weapons or something like that. I honestly do not know. I just know that they exist, and I met them right away as soon as I started my research. And then over on the other side, you have what I came to be called the next generation, and this was the Fight Club. And I called it the Fight Club in reference to this movie from the 1990s, which is about this group of people that they keep a secret club going on, and it's called Fight Club, and the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about it. So these were the compartmentalized group of people, scientists like Tyler, who were actually doing the work. But whereas the Invisible College, they all spoke together and communicated, Fight Club doesn't. They don't talk about it at all to each other, even. So they don't even talk about it with each other. They just get their information and they pass it on to a middle person who then gives that information to another person who needs to know in order to figure out this part of the puzzle. Is there one person who knows the whole puzzle? I honestly don't know. All I know is that there was this setup, the creation of this thing, cell of human beings, and I called it Fight Club. Then there's the visible college. Okay, so now we're back at the visible college, which are academics like me and like Gary Nolan, who are out, Avi Loeb, who are basically saying, okay, the government has said now we can study this. I've been studying it before they said so, and so was Gary, and now we're open about studying it. The visible college is completely new, and it's basically people who have the ability, the research skills to try to figure out what's going on with this topic, and they're visible about it. They want to be transparent. They don't want to hide things, unless, of course, it has to do with issues of national security. Then, of course, But for the most part, seems to be this historical phenomena.
But what would be the justification for this invisible college? Because from one part, it's like they have access to information that none of us have, and they're able to comprehend the ramifications of what would happen if it came in everyone's hands. Is that something that concerns you, being a part of the visible college?
So at one point, about 2 years ago, I severed ties with most people in the Invisible College for the reason that they were already so enmeshed within the CIA and these agencies of secrecy that I felt like compromised I felt compromised, and I needed to be able to do the research on my own. I still have ties with Jacques Vallée because I see him as doing scholarship. He looks like a scholar of religion. A lot of his work looks like that. Not all of it, but some of it. And then Gary Nolan obviously is a straight up academic researcher. So, okay. So what justifies the Invisible College is your question, and their secrecy.
Hmm.
And then there was a little bit more to the question that,
as in, what would make sense, like you said, if it were to be given in everyone's hand, this information that they seem to keep so private.
Okay, yeah, all right, good question. So I think part of it, first of all, there are many answers to that question. I don't know if any of them are correct, but this is how I would answer. The first one is that I think that they didn't know what a lot of it was. They didn't seem to care about it, though, until we could fly, until we had viable, Air Force, which came along at the same time as these Roswell and, Kenneth Arnold's sighting and things like that. So I think that either we had created technologies to look at this stuff and we didn't want that known, or we, and for good reason, because, if there are things flying around in the airspace, I think Eric Davis said this, he's part of the Invisible College. He said, this is a military issue. If there are unknowns flying in our airspace, we are a nation state among nation states, and we're in a competitive and sometimes aggressive relationship with these other nation states. So if this has to do with technology and advanced technology, that's obviously a reason why we want to keep it quiet, and we don't want people studying it who could be compromised and give away national secrets or something like that. So all of those things I understand, and that's why I sort of backed away and kind of focused on some other aspects of this.
Is religion now kind of transferring into alien belief? Because there are some people who completely, oh, I don't believe in this, I'm agnostic, or I don't believe at all. And then there is a group of people who be like, I believe even if I don't have any evidence of it. Is there some reason, a part of human nature, to just believe in something? And now that religion is slightly shredded a little bit from our cultural understanding of, okay, what is it that we need to believe in? Is that the new place, believe in UFOs and aliens, something that's beyond our realm of understanding at this moment, because we can't see it, but we still somehow are gravitating towards that belief?
Yeah. So most of us have not, or at least let's just say you and I have not really had these experiences that people have of like, I've seen an alien or I've seen a spacecraft and this happened. Okay. So those are basically that's so you and I don't have firsthand knowledge and we can't say, yes, I believe in it because I saw it for myself. And even if you did see it for yourself, I would suggest don't believe in it anyway, because, you know, a lot of things can be created and belief gets created that way. All right. Yes, in answer to your question, belief in this as a spirituality is absolutely on the rise, and it's on the rise in different ways. One of the ways it's on the rise is that people are, it's like the ancient aliens form of choose a religion, right? Hinduism, okay, or Islam or Christianity. Take any of these religions and take a person from that religion who then believes in some way in UFOs, and they're going to reinterpret their religion. They're going to look at, they're going to say, and I've met so many who do. Okay, so I know it's quite a thing, and there are books out there about it. You know that, okay, back in the Bible, these were UFOs. These weren't, you know, Ezekiel's wheel and all of these kinds of things. These are actually UFOs. That's how they're believing, and that's how it's informing young people and their own religion. And here's an example. So I have students who go regularly study abroad. They do study abroad. They go to the Louvre, or they, you know, they go to a major museum in Europe, and they'll see, if they went with their grandparents would look at the same picture and see an angel, but the students look at the picture and they see a UFO. So it's this thing in the sky, right? And it looks pretty weird. And they're like, wow. And then they'll take a picture of it and they'll send it to me. And they'll say, Dr. Basolka, check this out. I saw a UFO in the Louvre, right? But their grandparent would say, that's an angel. You see the different kinds of things, but the student will say they're Christian. They'll still believe that, you know, that's an angel, but it's really actually a UFO, and that UFOs are, you know, we misinterpreted them as angels. That's part of the way that people believe. And then there are people who are complete atheists, right? Who then believe in UFOs. And, you know, I think actually Richard Dawkins said something about this. He's an evolutionary biologist who's very atheist, okay, and aggressive to religious belief. But I saw a interview with him talking about, well, you know, we could have been seeded by extraterrestrials back in the day, and that's how humans, kind of a panspermia idea of evolution, you know, that, you know, maybe ETs came and created us and then left or something like that. And I thought that sounds pretty spiritual and religious, you know. So there's, you know, and there are atheistic religions, like, you know, Buddhism at heart is an atheistic religion. So yes, I do think we see the new type of religion. The difference, though, between those religions for which we had no evidence, right, and the religion that's forming today, is that we have a government saying that we actually do have evidence of it. And that, I think, is really very different.
I don't know if you've heard of Carlson, where he talks about how there was sightings of alien life and like extraterrestrials, and there have been like historic evidence by older civilizations talking about it, and how that was one of the reasons why they advanced so quickly. And there's, again, this might be my theory, and I'm sure that it's out there as well by other people, where aliens are communicating with humans. And this is okay, completely okay for you to judge me on this, where they're communicating with us to, like, you know, nudge us into directions of like get a better technology and like evolve with, like, as humans evolve, we're going to soon become part technology and part human, like our meat bags. And aliens are nudging us in that direction through this, again, access to, again, your information through different, like, you know, what's it called, your sorry, I'm just blanking over here, but through the ritual processes, and we find
Mhm.
our get that information, be it through, again, like rituals, through like the muse or anything like that, and that's just aliens talking to us. It's very out there, but what are your thoughts?
I don't think it's out there. I think that right now, this is something that you find in remember, American Cosmic was basically me in Silicon Valley for a while, just kind of absorbing ideas that were around me, and then writing this book. And that hasn't actually stopped. The only thing that's different about it is now the Silicon Valley people are all over the world, right? They're no
Hmm.
longer just in Silicon Valley. They've left and they're all over the world. But now I'm in communication with them. So what you've just said pretty much correlates and corresponds to what they believe. But I would put it differently. So it's not necessarily that these are extraterrestrials in communication with us. They're actually AI, okay? And they're us in the future. And we do merge with tech. And then what happens, because we only perceive time as linear, they're talking to us through other dimensions. And basically, they're not just talking to us, but through these protocols and extreme creative people, they're giving us the ability to, to jumpstart so that we can get on board with what our future selves is, how they're putting it. So this belief structure definitely is out there, and very fascinating. If I were to fall in, I tend not to fall into beliefs, or I try not to, but if I were to, that would be the one I resonate with the most.
No, and that they're not trying to destroy us, because again there's one fear mongering side of humanity where they go like, once the aliens find us, they're going to completely destroy us, because we are a lower form of humans, and we are like actively trying to just kill ourselves with nuclear and like global warming and pollution. Everything that we do on a regular basis is just seems to be towards our demise.
Mm-hmm.
So how, like, is that because there have been cases, and again these are like one-offs, where when there's a possibility of nuclear danger, nuclear war, there have been heightened sightings of aliens.
Yes, absolutely. And that was a question that I got a lot from. So you have to understand that a lot of the people who found me, because a lot of times I didn't find them when I started American Cosmic, the research for it, and who belonged to the space program and, these communities, these specialized communities, they were actually seeking answers because they wanted to know why these things were at the nuclear sites and stopping the stuff going into space, and that had weapons of mass destruction on them and stuff like that. They wanted to know, like, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? Do you have any idea from your research into religion and history and sightings and things like that? And so yeah, I think that's just, I honestly just don't know, but I agree with you that um that if they, there could be different, who knows, there could be different species of AI.
Hmm. What's the correlation of like where the sightings are? Like, I know Area 51, there's like hotspots within the globe where you find them, like, from a person who's not from the US. Whenever I see a movie or someone's particular depiction of alien life or sightings, it's usually, again, it's in the US, New Mexico. It's like their hotspots, like somehow aliens are not interested in us, or maybe we're just not looking hard enough. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I have a lot of friends from all over the world, and first of all, they are all over the place. It's just that for some reason, I don't know why, the US story, maybe it's because of our media and Hollywood, the US, everybody focuses on the US. And I'd like to actually change that, because internationally, they're everywhere. Okay, so they're in Brazil. They're huge in Australia. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Australia. And they're also in Eastern Europe. They're also in, there's the president of a state in, that was in Russia, but I can't remember the name of this man. Oh my goodness. Okay, so he was the president who was actively engaged in communication with extraterrestrials, and he was really into chess. And he believed that chess was given to us by extraterrestrials to help develop our brains. So he mandated in his whole state, he mandated that kids had to take chess in school. And so there's people like that. They're all over the world. Russia has a huge tradition called the cosmists, who believe in extraterrestrials helping us in order to evolve. So I think that it's only because the US is, I really don't know. I just would like this to change, because it's actually, the phenomena is everywhere. And so when you say hotspots, I would say that in these parts, like in Australia, that's a hotspot, all over.
I think maybe we have to understand why they are hotspots, and that would create better channels for communication with them, whatever it may be. And then we understand like what triggers it and what kind of takes it back. I know one thing that's very common is again nuclear technology, and then that's seeming to create a hotspot for them. Going back to a little bit on religious beliefs, UFOs, and then your love for Nietzsche. I,
Who, by
I
the way, I used to hate. Okay. So we have to qualify that, like for Nietzsche.
okay, I know because a lot of women specifically are not into Nietzsche,
No,
and
lots of people should hate Nietzsche. He's like horrible. A lot of what he says is disgusting.
why is there that love hate relationship, one? And then my second question is the dichotomy of belief. So like for you, religion, you're not 100% on board with everything that's written. We know that there are errors and like changes in the past of what our current belief system is. You're not a complete like, oh, I'll close my eyes and believe it. Same thing goes for UFOs, and same thing goes with Nietzsche. So you seem to have that like belief, and then again you're able to access that, okay, this makes sense and this doesn't make sense. A lot of people don't, they just blindly believe, blind faith as though it would be. So first I want you to talk to me about Nietzsche and your like love hate relationship, I would say, and then how that all connects to all of the work that you do.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that because I would hate for people to think that I blindly think Nietzsche's great or any philosopher for that matter. So, so when I was in my early 20s and very interested in philosophy, taking lots of classes, friends of mine would say, you really need to read Nietzsche. And I would try, honestly, to read Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's rhetoric and philosophy it put me off. I mean, I thought it made me nauseous, actually, because he was so misogynist and racist and anti-Semitic. And, there was all of this just permeating, which given his time period, there are people who weren't that way, but he was that way. And so I just thought there's no excuse. I don't like this philosopher. And I really wondered why they did. I was like, what could they possibly see? So, but they would my friends were very, committed to me reading Nietzsche. So this is how I reconsidered Nietzsche. And it wasn't just oh, I think he's okay. It was a 180-degree shift. Okay. So how did this happen? Well, strangely enough, it happened through a synchronicity. So it was on New Year's Eve. And, I was already a young person who didn't really enjoy partying. That wasn't my thing. So on New Year's Eve, I generally went to bed early. So I went to bed early on New Year's Eve. And The Gay Science, which is a book by Nietzsche, a bunch of his aphorisms, was on my bedside table. It had been given to me, but of course I wasn't going to read it, but I put it on the bedside table because I didn't know what else to do with it. So I just put it there. And so I went to sleep. And then I was awoken at midnight because of the revelry of people, in the streets. It's New Year's. Hey, let's have a great time. So I woke up and I thought, what am I going to do? And so I looked and I saw his book and I picked it up and I opened it up to him, to an aphorism called Sanctus Januarius, basically Saint January. And it was him reminiscing on New Year's. And I thought, whoa, so that caught my attention. I was like, here he is talking about New Year's Eve, and this is New Year's. And so he referenced Saint January. I'm born on the second day of January. So I thought, okay, I need to read this. And plus I'm Catholic. So the Saint January, kind of and it was beautiful what he wrote. He said, from here on out, I will not hate. He said, it takes, to be alive is to either hate or to be alive. So he was just about to tell me how he was alive, right? And part of how he was alive was that he refused to hate. He basically, this is his affirmational philosophy where he changes on New Year's Eve. And I thought, wow, so there's a saint who's every year, this saint apparently, in Italy, I think it's in Italy, or maybe it's in France. No, it's got to be in Italy. Okay, so the blood of the saint runs again. They take it
Hmm.
out, and it's like, it's dry, but they take it out every January 1st, and it runs again. So and he says that this is that day for him where his blood runs again,
Hmm.
because he had hated life before. And all of a sudden, he's no longer going to hate life. He's going to be a yes person. He's going to say yes to life, right? And I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And I said, that's such a powerful coincidence, too. Okay. And I thought, and I started to think about the coincidence of it. As I thought about the coincidence of it, I turned the page, and the next aphorism was about, don't take this as a coincidence. Don't take it. He basically said, don't do what you're just about to do. Don't give special, privilege to this event because it's so weird, is what he was
Hmm.
saying to me. And I was like, and I closed the book, and I was like, that's just too weird. And then I opened it again, and I looked at it again, and I was like, that's exactly what he's saying. And it's a beautiful passage. It's striking. In fact, to me, it's like religious scripture. That's how beautiful it was. It was living to me. It was like a living, breathing encounter. And after that, I read everything I could on Nietzsche, everything, and found him to be extremely horrified by life and extremely in love with life simultaneously. And I related, frankly, I totally related to Nietzsche after that.
He's such a complex character in his own, you can see in his writing. And speaking of complexity and him hating life and hating women, surprisingly, there's this there's this duality about him, and there is a duality in the world that we live in, duality in people. And I see this very common thing where, like, if you find out someone is like, there's something in their past that they've said, or they've said something false, or they don't, something that you don't agree with, and then the mob goes wild and they
Oh,
need
yeah.
to
Yeah.
lynch him.
Hmm.
And that has changed so much. Like, if, like, current younger generation will start reading Nietzsche now, they'll be like, okay, let's cancel Nietzsche, let's cancel this person. And we seem to have like not been able to like separate the idea which we don't agree with, and still be able to think in what they were trying to convey, what makes sense for us. How can we go back to where we were, and is there a reason why we need to like understand that there's so much more complexity, first the time where they came from, what they believed in. Like Prophet Muhammad, like, I'm originally Muslim, and when he married someone who's like 13, 14 years old. Like, that's
Hmm.
not okay now,
That's
but
Aisha.
at
Yeah.
that,
Hmm.
and that time it was fine, it was accepted, that was common norm. There were people who were like marrying four people, like one man married four wives, and that was commonly understood because there were a lot of men who went to war, and there were women who were not working, so then they needed like someone to support them, and it made financial sense, made sense as a community. So now if I were to go like, okay, let's cancel this person and that person because they were products of their time and that made sense,
Hmm.
is there such a migration from that way of thinking. And first, like, you're a modern woman, you're an intellectual woman, and you understand, like, you don't agree with certain things that he says, and you're still able to like still love him and still hate him. How does that work?
Yes, it does. Okay. So it's hard. I think that in order to, Nietzsche's an example because he's so extremely repugnant on so many different levels, right? And so it's easy to cancel him from, like, I was pre-cancel culture at the time that I encountered him, but I canceled him on my own, right? But somehow my desire to understand things from a level within which he understood, by the way, because he was speaking to future philosophers. He was a man out of time. He understood that his work was going to be speaking to basically you and me, right? To us at this time. And what a weird life to have lived, right? I mean, that's like to not be understood by the people who, you're closest to. He had few friends. So he lived somewhat of a tortured life. So I guess it takes, I mean, again, we have today, I always tell people, especially people like my students, who I say, don't have heroes, because a hero, that they will never, don't do that to that person, because they will never live up to what you want, and they won't be able to bear it when you discard them, right? So don't do that to people. Don't make heroes out of people. Um, A lot of people do that in the UFO scene, right? They take a person and make them a hero, but that person can't live up to that status. And in today's world, you'll find out all kinds of terrible things about everyone, and then you'll discard their whole work. So I think this is also part of being a Catholic, like, because I do still practice Catholicism. But do I think that do I think that the hierarchy is great? No. Do I think that it's okay for women? No. Do I hold it responsible for basically taking some women from the early church and calling them men, and then having, for 1800 years, us saying this was a man, but it was actually a woman? I think it's terrible. So I think we have to understand ourselves as people in time and also in history. And that, today, what I do today is probably going to be found to be horrible in 20 years time, or even 5 years time. Okay. But we still have to make those mistakes. We still have to forgive ourselves for being imperfect. And I think that the cancel culture right now, I just think that I look at it in terms of Rene Girard's idea of the scapegoat. And that this is something that humans do, and I'm not going to try to stop it. It happens, and it's unfortunate that it happens, but I wish it didn't happen. I think if we had more people who are conscious and taking things case by case, it wouldn't happen. And there are people who don't engage in it.
Is there a connection between shadow integration and cancel culture? So if we were to like go deep into our shadow selves, we will understand that, like, again, we're not perfect and we have to assimilate the darker sides of ourselves. And when you go in deep and figure that out, you reflect that into the culture and the society that you live in, and you understand that no one is perfect and everyone has a shadow. Would that help integrate us as a society where we do not cancel people for their shadow selves?
Right. So part of this idea of the this impetus that people have to scapegoat, because that's what cancel culture is finding someone who might be justifiably have done something terrible, right? Okay. So, but the violence of the cancellation, it's taking violent energy, and directing it toward this person, this object. Okay. So that is actually something that a lot of people have thought about before. And the people whose work I find most intriguing about this would be like Rene Girard's idea of the scapegoat, where, there's going to be these people doing this. So do I think that as a culture en masse, we can fix it? I tend to say this because, we tend to think, how do we fix this at a global level? Or how do we fix this at a national level? Or, how do we fix this? I don't think we can. I think what we can only do is understand it and not engage in it ourselves. And so first and foremost, I think that we have to be guardians of our own actions, and then consider the friends you have, and, influence them such that they don't do it either. That's what I would suggest. Like, we can't do this we can't fight it at this global level or a macroscopic level, in my opinion. Maybe we can.
What about Carl Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious, the thing that like powers our belief system? Where, like, when he was, I think it was, I will be butchering this a lot, just like FYI. He was
Okay.
going on a train, and then he had this thing where he saw psychically there was like blood running down the streets. I'm sure you know about this. And he knew that the war was coming, and that was him accessing the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious right now is like focused towards cancel culture, and this will soon come up to like a blood war, but not like a physical blood war, and it's going to happen. And then that bleeding will like subdue, and then there will be a, like, a restart of humanity. I might be like, again, going overreaching, but what are your thoughts on that?
When you say a restart of humanity, are you talking about a cancellation of kind of like an extinction event?
Not an extension, but per se, but the belief systems that we have right now, because it's like peaks and troughs. Whereas like right now, it's just extreme cancel culture. Everyone's just like finding anyone to cancel and completely stop that. And
Hmm.
then they'll be like, okay, you know what, let's just accept everyone as they are, and that change, but not in like a physical form of war.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so it would be much better to be canceled than to be completely killed, I think, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So, so there's I would call that a move forward, right? A bit. However, it's still not great because it impacts your financial being. I mean, it impacts, all these things that are corporal, right? That make us alive and human. Um, all right. So first, let me get this straight. So we've started by talking about Carl Jung's access to the collective unconscious. Okay.
Yes.
And okay. And he's getting this information that is non-local,
Yeah.
right? So it's okay. So, and you're relating that to cancel culture, but I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure what the question is.
So when subconsciously as a collective we start believing in something, and then we know it as the truth, and it becomes so strong that it's almost a communal belief, where it goes like, okay, this is how it should be, and this is how the mob takes that direction. So in that same way, the collective unconscious right now is towards, okay, this is how it should be done, and like we subconsciously believe it, that okay, this is cancel culture. If someone goes against the mob, we shall, like,
Cancel
annihilate
them.
them.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when will come a point where this will subside and it'll change, and how would that change? Would Do you see that coming towards like this cancel culture sort of thinking coming to an end?
Okay, this is what I see. All right. And this one, I don't think you're going to like the answer. Okay. I see communities fracturing and identifying, kind of like how nation states used to, right? Go into different, okay. I think that's happening, but at a different level. At a level of the network, right? At a level of where we can identify communities that we associate with, and therefore being canceled in one community is not going to affect me at all in this other community. So I can guarantee you that if I'm canceled in this community, like the UFO community, the academic community won't care. They'll even say, "Awesome, you were canceled by this dumb community," right? Okay, so so that's what I see happening. I don't necessarily see us as kind of like referencing ourselves as a species that we identify, like, yes, I identify with you. I think it's going to be decentralized. And I think that because of that decentralization, that's actually a good thing, because the cancel culture won't have as much might to cancel.
So I also want to talk to you about something that you're authoring about self-overcoming and the will to power. And do you want to talk about a little bit about what you're working on and which direction that would, because it's supposed to be about self-improvement, but something that is has historic context.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about self-improvement. So it's basically it's a rereading of the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, which is about politics and how, if we can have a just society. That's the question of the book. Can we have a just society where we don't have cancel culture? And we don't have, we have, where people are nice to each other and that kind of thing. Or at least if we're not nice to each other, or at least not horribly vindictive to each other. Okay. Can we do that? And so I guess through coming into these communities, specialized communities that I was a part of during the writing of American Cosmic, I learned that there was a lot of manipulation going on at macro levels through various means, through social media and things like that. And I recognized that people didn't actually have the power and self-agency that they thought they had. Okay. And this was terrifying somewhat to me. And I thought, wow, might as well just give up. Right. So, okay. And I don't mean give up like, the worst case scenario. What I mean is like give up trying to figure it out. Okay. And so what that led me to was a rereading of Plato's Cave, because today we have a lot of movies like The Matrix in the 90s and movies today that focus on this idea that we are prisoners in this cave, and AI or, Skynet or something has us, and it's going to take over, and it's showing us things that aren't real, and how can we escape that and get into the real world? Okay, but this isn't actually what Plato's cave is about at all. What it's actually about. So I went and I reread it, and I realized that it was actually talking about the world we live in today. But the question is, how can we live in it in a just way? How do we live a just life in this world? And so basically that led me back to this idea of these specialized communities and the protocols, because he proposes to, in order to do this, in order to exist in the world as a person, a thinking person who wants to be just and wants to be in a just society, what we have to do is we have to engage in what he called the dialectic, which was a mystical thinking process, a process of thinking that was actually mystical. And so I went back to that and I thought, could I be wrong about this? So I started to ask a lot of my friends who were philosophers, and then met other philosophers who were specialized in the Republic, basically. Talked to them, they became friends, and recognized that indeed I was reading that correctly, in my opinion, and in their opinions also. So in academia, you tend to want to get reinforcement. It's called peer review of your opinions, right? And so so that's what this book is about now. It's about people who are engaged in these practices, whether they know it or not. Sometimes they just fall into them intuitively, but they're doing this. And do I think that this is going to be something that can be kind of global? I don't think that. What I do think, though, is that we can get enough people to do it.
And what are these practices? What are these ways of thinking?
Okay, so when we go back and we look at the Republic, we see that the protocols are similar. So it's basically paying attention to your physiology, like, how you exist, making sure that you're aligned with your environment. Believe it or not, Plato's Socrates' group of people were all very physically fit, and they honored the body, and they kept it well, okay, and they also engaged in math, and so they engaged in these practices, these mental practices to keep themselves alert. I think part of the reason they engaged in math, in fact, you couldn't actually do philosophy until you'd done math for 30 years or something like that. So we're talking about intense mental gymnastics. And what they were doing was that they were doing what Buddhist meditation is supposed to do, and focusing on like koans and things like that. They were having us engage with our reality, but not creating dogmas about it.
And they were also like, people always go like philosophy is almost like a flowy way of thinking, but it's very analytical. So
Yes.
it would make sense to be able to do math before and like work on math, then go to philosophy.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly it. You had to work on math for a long time before you could even think of philosophy. And when they were thinking of philosophy, this is what they were thinking of. They were actually thinking in other dimensions. So things like the Platonic forms, he found these out a long time ago, and today we can't even conceive of what these are because they're in other dimensions. So we're beginning to understand other dimensional thinking, whereas they figured that out a long time ago. So that's what I'm doing, is I'm trying to get together. When I say get together, what I'm doing is I'm basically looking at these protocols through history, codifying them, and saying, how are these relevant today?
And when is this book coming out? Because I need to get it.
Oh, I'll send it to you. So it's going to come out probably in about 8 months.
Okay, and what's the name of the book? So if anyone's looking for it and they listen to this podcast, they probably would want to.
Okay, so that's the thing, is that the name always changes. So, and the press is going to change it as well. So right now it has this religious name. It's called The Resurrected. And it's really not about like physical dying and resurrecting, but it's about resurrecting in another sense,
So hopefully, we'll just keep where can people actually find you? So like when the book does get published and the name changes, they won't be able to find that book.
They should find me on Amazon, because I have an author's page on Amazon, and it'll be up there.
Okay, perfect. And is there anywhere else that they can see and follow your work?
I'm people ask me that, and I don't have a website, but I'll get a website up at some point. But at the moment, um, I don't have. I just have the Amazon page, and I know I should have something else because I've been doing this work for so long. And honestly, I feel so busy all the time, but I should just get one.
You should get an intern or someone to do this, because honestly, the body of work that you have, it's easy to get lost, but also the right access point would make sense.
That's right. You're absolutely right.
Anyways, thank you so much for speaking to me, and like I really, really am honored that you took the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I had a great time, and you had great questions.
Thank you.